Welcome to Afterwards, and welcome especially Vali Nasr. It's a treat for me to see you after a long time away. It's great to have you here, and I have to tell you, I did enjoy your book for perhaps different reasons, but I'll go through that. But I wanted to thank you very much for coming in today. Vali Nasr is with us. He's the Dean of the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins and author of the book, The Dispensable Nation, which I have here, American Foreign Policy in Retreat. Vali Nasr is an Iranian-American political commentator, scholar of contemporary Islam in the Middle East. He has briefed presidents, Congress, many influential and not so influential people. He was born in Tehran in 1960, and his family came to the United States having left Iran after the revolution. He has a bachelor's from Tufts, a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, and earned his PhD in political science from MIT. Well done. I won't go through your long list of accomplishments. They are special, but I would especially draw attention, and it's a great part of your book, which was the time you spent working under Richard Holbrooke, 2009 to 2011, as part of the special office, special advisor on Pakistan and Afghanistan, now special advisor to the Secretary of State. There always are other offices, one discovers, that do the same thing you do, and that's part of the problem, as you lay out in your book, which I found fascinating. Other works that you've done, Shia Revival, which I've used in courses I've done, How Conflicts Within Islam Will Shape the Future, Forces of Fortune, The Rise of the New Middle Class and What It Will Mean for Our World. And in these you foretell certain great events that do come. The rise of sectarianism, although I didn't always agree with the full-scale war, but I have to say you, I think, woke a lot of people up to what was clearly coming, and also the potential for the Arab Spring, although I have to say I think that we've all been surprised about not that it happened, but how fast it happened, where it happened, and certainly where it's going. So I also want to say before we get started, I guess it's confession in a way, but I had almost a fatal attraction to reading your book. And in part, it's the kind of fatalism that if you've been around and watched, and I have observed many of the inner struggles. For me, this was the revelation, one of the revelations in your book, the struggles that go on in the making of policy that few people see. Right. Most people like to see that everything is fine, right. The great minds, the best minds come together, That's the right. great leaders, and after a careful talking and analysis, come to decisions on policy. And I think you and I know that it's not quite that simple. It's certainly not that easy a process. I sometimes tell my students, if you know the old saying, if you like sausage, don't watch it made. Right. If you are interested in policy, you really don't want to know too much about the behind the scenes. But you know, when I think back at the past 10 years in particular, regardless of administration, we've been watching how sausage is being made. So much has been brought out into the open that I think it's made the art of political compromise and negotiation within government, let alone to forward a policy, much more difficult than maybe it used to be. It's hard to see that it could have been worse. But I think the point is, it's not always as pretty or as tasteful or as thoughtful as we would like, and it's not always about principles. Sometimes it's about something which I think you lay out very clearly. It's about power. Mm-hmm. It's about influence. It's about what the Arab world calls wasta.
That's right.
It's so much who you know and what you can do, and basically getting your way. So what I'd like to do in the time we have together is to go through some of these things. I have a long list of questions, of course, that come to mind. And I think there's sort of two parts in a way, because much of the book, and I think the greatest value and the greatest contribution is on the time you spent as a participant, what you were able to observe in your work with Holbrooke and how he worked. The man had a reputation larger than life and was a very forceful actor on the scene. Watching someone like that in operation is always important and I think is influencing. But it reminds me that, you know, when you watch how policy is made, I don't mean to talk too much on this, but I did want to start here, that you do have the professionals, the diplomatic corps. You even have generals who are professionals as diplomats and know how to operate in that environment. And you like to think that the goal is conflict resolution and peace without war, advancing U.S. interests and those of our allies and friends, how to make concessions, how to negotiate.
Right.
And it's not. There's so much in terms of personal satisfaction, the egos of the players involved, and their vision and their view is the most important. And sometimes it's where you sit that the power is, and sometimes it's not. And that's the dark side of, I think, a lot of this. I think there's also the problem, insiders can be defined in many different ways. You have the insiders that are around a president.
That's right.
Or around the Secretary of State. Secretary Clinton certainly had her insiders. Every Secretary of State has. Every president has. And sometimes they consult with the professionals.
And sometimes they don't.
And sometimes they don't.
Right.
Exactly. And sometimes the principles they operate on don't upset anything.
That's right.
Think about the election. There's always an election coming. Think about interest groups that you don't want to aggravate. It adds that layer, which is very difficult to deal with. So let's start with some of these very basic questions, if we can.
Sure, please.
You talk a lot about the different influences. There's the military that's feeding into this picture, and the professional diplomatic corps, and the friends of the president and his advisors. And you have the intelligence community, and certainly have some choice bits to say about the CIA. I'll come back to that. I have a question or two there. But, and the vice president, who also, especially in this administration, and in the last, under the Bush administration, has insisted on playing a larger role. Whether that's always good or not, it's not the point. The point is it's another base to deal with. So tell me, Vali, well, who decides the options? How are these options framed? And who should be? I mean, who really should have the more of the input, if you would?
Well, very good questions you asked. When we came to Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was really the big war that the Obama administration set before itself, had to manage, it was their war, whereas Iraq was really President Bush's war, Afghanistan was President Obama's war. I think one of the main issues, and it's still there, is really the overhang of Iraq. Yeah. So we started actually looking at Afghanistan not really on the basis of its own merits in terms of what does it need, what our interests are, how do we come to some kind of conclusion and closure in a way that is good for the region and protects us. We started really from the premise of Iraq. So in Iraq, Bush did X, therefore we should do Y, or we cannot do X because Bush had done Y. And this, I think, was a problem to begin with. And I don't think the administration ever was, even going back into the campaign, able to craft for the president a national security image which was not constantly measured against Iraq.
True.
So he was the good president because he would do exactly the opposite of Bush. I mean, even if you look at it right up to now, the claim to fame is that Bush took us into the region and we're taking it out. So every time you talk about our Afghanistan policy, you inevitably end up comparing it to Iraq. And I think that's a big problem. The second is that Iraq did produce the US military as a two-ton foreign policy elephant, because they're not the ones who caused the war. The war was the decision of the civilians in the Pentagon, in the White House, and some in the State Department. And the way that the war played out, that in the end the military became the savior. And General Petraeus ended up being the hero of the Iraq war with the surge. The surge ended up being the military's solution to a catastrophe caused by civilians. And the military also, as the expression goes, drank its own Kool-Aid too much on Iraq. So it came out thinking that it deserves all the resources it can get. It has the solution to the problem. It really doesn't need civilians. It definitely doesn't need diplomats.